The letter arrived at 6 in the morning, and by 6:15, Edward Hartley understood that his entire life was about to end. He read it twice, standing in his study in his shirt sleeves, the fire barely lit, his hands cold around the paper. His uncle's solicitor had written in a careful, unbothered hand, as if the words themselves did not carry the weight of a falling house. The will was clear. If Edward did not marry before sundown the next day, the entire estate of Cresthaven would pass to his cousin Gerald Pierce. Every acre, every tenant farm, every roof over every family who had depended on the Hartley name for generations. Gone, handed to a man who had once burned down a hunting lodge for entertainment and laughed about it at dinner. Edward sat down hard in his chair. He had known his uncle disliked him. He had not known the man's dislike would outlive him and take the shape of a legal trap with teeth. He called for his solicitor within the hour. Mr. Whitfield arrived pale and out of breath, having ridden through the rain without stopping to change his coat. "Is there truly no way around it?" Edward asked. Whitfield shook his head slowly. "Your uncle was thorough, Your Grace. The clause is airtight. Married by a licensed clergyman with witnesses before sundown tomorrow. If not, the estate transfers automatically. There is no court in England that can stop it in time." "Then I need a wife," Edward said, and the words tasted strange in his mouth, like a joke with no one left to laugh at it. "You have less than 2 days," Whitfield said. "Every eligible young woman in the county already suspects something is wrong. Word travels fast when a duke starts asking about special licenses." Edward stood and walked to the window. Outside, the fields of Cresthaven rolled toward the horizon, gray under the morning clouds. Somewhere out there were 400 people who worked this land, lived on it, raised children on it, and none of them knew that their entire future depended on whether he could find a woman willing to marry a stranger by tomorrow evening. He did not sleep that night. He spent it reading through lists of names, women whose families might accept a rushed marriage for the right price, and found himself disgusted with every option. A marriage built on nothing but urgency felt like theft, even if the woman agreed to it willingly. By morning, he had made no progress, and less than a day remained. His carriage broke down on the road just past the village of Thornfield, the wheel splitting with a crack loud enough to startle the horses. Edward stepped out into the mud, furious in the quiet way of a man who has run out of patience for the world's inconvenience, and looked around for anywhere he might wait while his driver found a wheelwright. The nearest building had a faded sign above the door, "Voss's Apothecary." Inside, the air smelled of dried herbs and something sharp, like vinegar mixed with mint. A woman stood behind the counter, sleeves pushed up past her elbows, grinding something in a stone bowl with more force than the task seemed to require. She did not look up when the bell above the door rang. "If you're here for the cough tonic, it isn't ready," she said. "Come back this afternoon." "I am not here for tonic," Edward said. Something in his voice made her look up. She studied him for a moment, taking in the fine coat now streaked with mud, the tired eyes, the posture of a man trying very hard to appear calm. "You're the Duke," she said. "It was not a question." "Edward Hartley, and you are." "Busy," she said, and went back to grinding. He almost laughed. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him like that, without the careful politeness people used around titles. "Margaret Voss," he said, reading the name painted on a jar behind her. "Your father's shop." "My shop now. My father passed 2 years ago." She set down the bowl. "Is there a reason a duke is standing in my apothecary looking like he hasn't slept in a week?" Edward considered lying. He considered walking back out into the rain and trying his luck elsewhere. But something about her directness, the lack of performance in her voice, made him decide against it. "I need to be married by tomorrow evening," he said, "or I lose everything my family has built for 200 years. Margaret blinked. Then, to his surprise, she laughed, a short sound with no cruelty in it, just genuine disbelief. That is the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me in this shop, and I once had a man try to buy a love potion for his horse. I am not joking. I did not think you were. That is what makes it strange. She wiped her hands on her apron and leaned against the counter, studying him properly now. So what happens? You walk in here, tell a stranger your family is about to collapse, and expect her to fall into your arms out of pity. No, Edward said. I expect nothing. I am simply out of time and out of options, and you are the first person I've met in 2 days who has not tried to flatter me or fear me. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved to the shelves behind her, the neat rows of jars and bottles, the ledger open on the counter with numbers written in red ink, more red than black. Edward did not know what those numbers meant yet, but he watched her expression change as she looked at them, something tight forming at the corner of her mouth. "What would I get out of marrying you?" she asked finally. "A title security, whatever allowance a duchess is due." "And what would you take from me?" "Nothing you do not offer." She studied him a moment longer as if trying to decide whether he believed his own words. Then she closed the ledger with a soft snap. "I have debts, Your Grace. My father left this shop buried under them, and I have spent 2 years trying to dig it out with my own 2 hands. If I agree to this, and I have not said I will, there would be a condition." "Name it." "You do not touch my shop. You do not touch my inheritance, small as it is. And you do not touch me. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. I will wear your ring and stand beside you in public, and beyond that my life remains my own." Edward had expected demands for jewelry, for status, for control over servants and households. He had not expected a woman to draw a line around herself and ask for nothing but to be left alone. "Agreed," he said, before he could think better of it. "You should think about this longer than you are thinking about it," Margaret said. "I have less than a day to think, Mrs. Voss." "Miss," she corrected, "I am a widow, not a wife anymore. My husband died 3 years ago." She said it flatly, the way a person states an old fact they have grown tired of explaining. Edward did not press. He had learned enough that morning to know some doors were shut for good reason. "I will send a carriage for you within the hour," he said. "The ceremony will need to happen quickly. Tomorrow, if we are to make the deadline with any room to spare." Margaret looked around her shop one last time, at the shelves she had rebuilt herself, the counter where she had spent 2 years arguing with creditors and grinding herbs until her hands ached. Then she looked back at him. "One more thing," she said. "If you break your word, if you so much as touch the money I bring into that house without asking, I will walk out the front door and let your cousin have every stone of your estate. Do you understand me?" "Completely," Edward said, and found that he meant it more seriously than he had meant almost anything in years. She held out her hand, not for him to kiss but to shake, like men did over a deal at market. He took it, and her grip was firm and unafraid. "Then I suppose I am about to become a duchess," Margaret said, and there was no joy in her voice, only the flat calculation of a woman who had learned to survive by making hard choices quickly. Edward walked back out into the rain feeling something he had not expected. Not relief exactly. Something closer to the feeling of stepping onto solid ground after a long time standing at the edge of a cliff. He did not know yet how much that handshake would come to matter, or how the woman behind the counter, with her red ledger and her sharp tongue, was about to change the shape of everything he thought he understood about duty, about marriage, and about himself. Behind him, in the apothecary, Margaret stood very still for a long moment after the bell above the door stopped ringing. She looked down at her hand, still warm from his grip, and then at the ledger full of red numbers that had haunted her sleep for 2 years. Tomorrow, she thought, she would sign her name beside a stranger's and become someone else entirely. She did not know yet that somewhere across the county, a man named Gerald Pierce had already heard the news of the Duke's carriage breaking down near Thornfield, and was smiling in a way that boded nothing good for anyone involved. The chapel at Cresthaven had not been used for a wedding in 11 years, and it showed. Dust lay thick along the pews, and the stained glass windows let in a weak, colorless light that made the whole room feel like it was holding its breath. Margaret stood at the altar in a borrowed gray dress, since there had been no time to have anything made, and watched Edward Hartley walk toward her looking like a man heading to his own execution rather than his wedding. She could not blame him. She felt much the same way. The vicar, an elderly man named Mr. Aldridge who had been paid handsomely to ask no questions, rushed through the ceremony with the speed of someone who understood exactly how much was riding on the clock. The only witnesses were Mr. Whitfield the solicitor and Nora, a maid from the estate who had been pulled away from polishing silver to stand in as a second witness. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, no one clapped. No one cried tears of joy. Edward and Margaret simply looked at each other across the small distance between them, two strangers now legally bound, and neither one moved to kiss the other. Mr. Aldridge cleared his throat awkwardly and suggested it was traditional, and Edward pressed the briefest, most formal kiss to Margaret's cheek instead, careful and distant, exactly as their agreement demanded. It was done. The estate was saved, and Margaret Voss, now Margaret Hartley, Duchess of Cresthaven, climbed into a carriage beside a man she had known for less than 2 days and rode toward a house she had never seen. Cresthaven looked grand from the outside, all gray stone and tall windows catching the afternoon light, the kind of house that appeared in paintings meant to impress visiting dignitaries. But the moment Margaret stepped through the front doors, she understood that the grandeur was only a shell. The entrance hall was cold despite the season, and she noticed immediately that half the candles in the wall sconces were unlit, not for lack of care, but for lack of funds to replace them. A housekeeper named Mrs. Fenwick greeted them with a tight, worried smile, the kind worn by someone who had been juggling too many problems for too long and had just been handed one more in the form of a new duchess. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Mrs. Fenwick said, and Margaret noticed her eyes flick nervously toward Edward before she added, "I've done what I can with the east wing, but the roof there is still letting in water when it rains hard." "How long has the roof been leaking?" Margaret asked. "Nearly a year, ma'am." Margaret looked at Edward, who suddenly seemed very interested in removing his gloves. "A year," she repeated. "There have been more pressing expenses," he said. "More pressing than the roof falling in on your own house." Edward did not answer immediately, and something about his silence told Margaret everything she needed to know. This was not a wealthy man pretending poverty for sympathy. This was a duke drowning quietly in debts he did not know how to discuss. That evening, after a supper eaten in near silence, Margaret asked to see the household ledgers. Edward hesitated, his hand resting on the leather cover of the account book as if deciding whether handing it over broke some unspoken rule between them. "You said you would not touch my inheritance," he said carefully. "I did not realize the agreement extended in the other direction." "It does not have to," Margaret said. "But I have spent 2 years reading numbers that terrified me, and I recognize the look on your housekeeper's face. That is the look of a household running out of road. If Cresthaven collapses under debt 6 months after our wedding, my condition about the shop and my inheritance will not matter, because there will be no dukedom left to protect either of us." Edward studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, he pushed the ledger across the table. What Margaret found inside kept her awake long past midnight. The estate was not simply struggling. It was hemorrhaging money through unpaid wages, decades-old repairs deferred until they became emergencies, and loans taken out by Edward's late uncle that had never been properly recorded or repaid. Tenant farms that should have been generating income were instead costing the estate money because equipment had not been maintained in years. She sat at the desk in the small study Mrs. Fenwick had shown her to, candle burning low, and began making notes in the margins the way she had once done for her father's shop. Numbers she could fix. Numbers made sense to her in a way that people rarely did. Edward found her there near 2 in the morning, still working, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the draft that crept through every wall of the house. "You do not have to do this," he said quietly. "I know," Margaret said, not looking up. "I am doing it anyway. A duchess with an empty title is bad for business, Your Grace, and my business now includes not starving." He almost smiled at that, the first genuine expression she had seen cross his face since they met. "You could simply take your allowance and let the rest fall apart around us. That was the arrangement." "That was the arrangement before I saw the state of your roof," Margaret said, finally looking up at him. "I do not like watching things fail when I know how to fix them. Call it a character flaw." Over the following days, Margaret threw herself into the work of untangling Cresthaven's finances, with the same fierce focus she had once used to save her father's shop from ruin. She renegotiated terms with 3 suppliers who had been overcharging the estate for years, uncovered a steward who had been quietly skimming funds, and dismissed him before lunch, and drew up a schedule for repairs that prioritized the roof over the ornamental gardens that no one had walked through in a decade. Edward watched all of this with a growing sense of disorientation. He had married a stranger to save his title, expecting at best a polite, distant arrangement, and at worst a woman who resented him for the rest of their lives. He had not expected someone who moved through his crumbling house like a small, determined storm fixing things he had not known how to fix himself. "You are better at this than my solicitor," he told her one evening, watching her cross out a line item with the same sharp efficiency she once used on herbal remedies. "Your solicitor did not grow up watching his father slowly go bankrupt because he was too proud to ask anyone for help," Margaret said. "I learned these lessons early, and I learned them the hard way." It was the most she had told him about her past since their wedding, and Edward did not push for more, sensing the same closed door he had noticed on the day they met. Word of the sudden marriage spread through the county quickly, as such things always did. Most of the reaction Margaret heard about secondhand, filtered through Mrs. Fenwick's careful reports, was curiosity mixed with polite disapproval. A duke marrying an apothecary's daughter from Thornfield, with no engagement, no courtship, no warning at all. The gossip painted Margaret as either a clever schemer or a desperate woman who had caught a title through luck, and she found she did not particularly care which version people believed, so long as they left her alone to fix the roof. Not everyone reacted with mere gossip. 10 days after the wedding, a letter arrived at Cresthaven addressed to Edward in handwriting he recognized immediately, sharp and slanted, belonging to his cousin Gerald Pierce. Edward read it standing in the entrance hall, and Margaret watched his face go through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, irritation, and finally something colder and more careful. "What does it say?" she asked. "Gerald is requesting a visit," Edward said. "To congratulate us on our marriage, he says." "You do not believe that is why he is coming." "Gerald has never congratulated anyone on anything in his entire life," Edward said. "He is coming to see if there is a crack in this marriage he can use to challenge the will. He lost the estate by less than 2 days, Margaret. A man like that does not simply accept defeat and walk away." Margaret felt something cold settle in her stomach, a familiar sensation from years of dealing with creditors who smiled while they searched for weaknesses to exploit. "Then we had better make certain there is nothing for him to find," she said. "There is nothing to find," Edward said. "We were married legally before witnesses before the deadline. The will's condition was satisfied." "Satisfied on paper," Margaret said. "Men like your cousin do not care about paper when they can invent a story instead. If he cannot challenge the marriage's legality, he will try to challenge its truth. He will look for anything that makes it appear we married for reasons that break the spirit of your uncle's will, even if the letter of it was followed perfectly." Edward looked at her with something like respect dawning behind his tired eyes. "You understand him already, and you have never met him." "I understand men who want something badly enough to lie for it," Margaret said. "I have met plenty of those in my life." 3 days later, Gerald Pierce arrived at Cresthaven in a carriage far too fine for a man who had just lost his claim to a dukedom. Wearing a smile that did not reach his eyes and carrying, Margaret noticed immediately, far too much interest in every detail of the house he no longer stood to inherit. He greeted Edward with a handshake that lasted a fraction too long, and turned to Margaret with a bow that felt more like an inspection than a courtesy. "So this is the woman who saved Cresthaven," Gerald said, his eyes moving over her with a coldness she recognized instantly, the look of a man cataloging weaknesses rather than admiring a new relation. "An apothecary's daughter, I hear. How resourceful of you, Cousin Edward, finding a solution so quickly." "Margaret has done more for this estate in 2 weeks than most duchesses manage in a lifetime," Edward said, an edge entering his voice that had not been there a moment before. "I am sure she has," Gerald said smoothly. "Though I confess I am curious about her history. A widow, is that correct? Tell me, Mrs. Hartley, whatever happened to your first husband?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Margaret felt every muscle in her body go tight. She kept her expression perfectly calm, the same careful mask she had worn through 2 years of hostile creditors, but inside, something old and unwelcome stirred awake. "He died," she said simply, "3 years ago." "How tragic," Gerald said, and his eyes lingered on her face a moment too long, searching for a crack. "I do hope, for your sake, that his affairs were left in better order than my late uncle's were. Debts have a way of following a family long after the person who created them is gone, do they not?" Margaret did not answer. She simply held his gaze until he looked away first, and Edward stepped smoothly between them, guiding the conversation toward the weather, toward the state of the roads, toward anything at all that was not his cousin's obvious fishing expedition. But after Gerald had gone, riding away in his too fine carriage with his too pleasant smile, Margaret stood alone in the entrance hall for a long time, staring at nothing. Edward found her there. "You do not have to tell me anything," he said quietly. "Whatever Gerald was hunting for, you owe me no explanation." "He will find it anyway," Margaret said, her voice quieter than he had ever heard it. "Men like Gerald always find the things you try hardest to bury." She did not elaborate further, and Edward did not ask again, but the look on her face stayed with him long after she had retreated to her study, and he found himself, for the first time since their strange and hurried wedding, wondering what exactly his new wife was so afraid of him discovering. The rumors began quietly, the way poison always does, a drop here and a drop there until the whole well turns bitter. Margaret first heard the whispers from Nora, who came to her one morning with flour still on her hands and worry pulling at the corners of her mouth. "They are saying things in the village, Your Grace," Nora said, "about your marriage, about you and the Duke marrying only to cheat the old will, not because either of you wanted to." "People have always assumed the worst about a hurried wedding," Margaret said, trying to sound unbothered even as her stomach tightened. "Let them talk." "It is more than talk now," Nora said. "There is a man asking questions in Thornfield. About your first husband, ma'am. About debts." Margaret set down the ledger she had been working on, her hands suddenly very still. "What kind of questions?" "Whether he left money owed. Whether the people he owed it to might still be looking for payment. Whether you knew about it when you married the Duke, or whether you hid it from him." The room seemed to grow colder, though the fire in the grate burned exactly as it had a moment before. Margaret had spent 3 years building walls around the worst chapter of her life, brick by careful brick, and now someone was taking a hammer to the foundation. She found Edward in his study that afternoon and told him everything. because she understood that Gerald would not stop digging until he had unearthed every detail himself, and she would rather Edward hear the truth from her than from his cousin's twisted version of it. "My husband was not a good man," Margaret said, standing rather than sitting, as if the story required her to stay on her feet. "Not cruel in the ways people whisper about, but reckless. He gambled. He borrowed from men who do not forgive a debt simply because the borrower has died. When he passed, I inherited nothing but his obligations, and it took me 2 years of scraping together every coin the shop earned just to satisfy the worst of them." "Did you satisfy all of them?" Edward asked, his voice careful and even. "All but one," Margaret said. "A man named Percival Crane. My husband owed him a significant sum, and Crane has made it clear over the years that he intends to collect it from me eventually, one way or another. I have avoided him as best I can. I did not think a duke's cousin would go looking for him on my behalf." Edward was quiet for a long moment. "Why did you not tell me this before we married?" "Because you needed a wife by sundown, and I needed money for my shop, and neither of us had the luxury of a lengthy courtship where such things are properly discussed," Margaret said, some of her old sharpness returning to her voice. "I did not lie to you. I simply did not offer information you did not ask for." "That is not the same as honesty." "No," Margaret agreed. "It is not. But it is what desperate people do, Your Grace, and I suspect you understand that better than most, given the circumstances of our own arrangement." Edward could not argue with that, and the silence between them stretched long and uncomfortable, filled with everything neither of them wanted to say. 2 days later, Gerald struck again, this time in public. The occasion was a ball at Lord Ashcombe's estate, one of the first social events Edward and Margaret had attended since their wedding, and Margaret had dressed carefully, determined to give the gossiping county nothing more to feed on than a composed and confident duchess. She had almost convinced herself the evening would pass without incident when Gerald appeared at her elbow near the refreshment table, his smile as sharp and pleasant as ever. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, loud enough for several nearby guests to turn their heads, "I have been doing a bit of reading recently. Court records mostly. Fascinating things, court records. Did you know your late husband's debts were never fully settled? A man named Crane still holds a claim against his estate, and by extension, I imagine, against you." The room seemed to hold its breath around them. Margaret felt dozens of eyes turn in her direction, felt the weight of curious, judgmental stares pressing against her skin like heat from a fire held too close. "Whatever debts my late husband left behind are a private matter," Margaret said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she let show. "Private, perhaps, until they become the business of a dukedom," Gerald said. "One wonders whether Cousin Edward knew he was marrying not just a wife, but her debts as well. One wonders whether the will's requirement for a legitimate marriage might be called into question, given the circumstances under which it was so hastily arranged, and the financial motivations that appear to have driven both parties toward the altar." "That is enough, Gerald." Edward's voice cut through the murmuring crowd, sharp and cold in a way Margaret had not heard from him before. He had crossed the ballroom quickly, drawn by the sudden hush, and now stood beside her with an expression that made several nearby guests take an involuntary step back. "You will not speak to my wife this way again, in this house or any other." "I am simply making conversation," Gerald said, all false innocence. "You are attempting to humiliate her in front of half the county because you cannot accept that you lost fairly," Edward said. "If you have concerns about the legality of my marriage, take them to a court, where they belong. Do not bring them to a ballroom dressed up as polite conversation." Gerald's smile finally slipped, just slightly, replaced by something colder underneath. "You may regret defending her so passionately, cousin, when the truth of her past becomes fully known." "I already know the truth," Edward said, and though the words were meant for Gerald, Margaret felt them land somewhere deep in her chest. "And it changes nothing about my respect for her." Gerald left shortly after, and the party resumed its careful pretense of normalcy, though Margaret could feel the whispers continuing beneath the music for the rest of the evening. She said little on the carriage ride home, staring out the window at the dark countryside sliding past, and Edward did not press her to speak, though she noticed him watching her more than once with an expression she could not quite read. The real danger arrived 3 nights later, and it did not announce itself with a smile or a clever insult. Margaret woke to the smell of smoke. She sat up sharply in bed, heart hammering, and for a disoriented moment thought she had dreamed it. Then she heard the shouting from below, Mrs. Fenwick's voice raised in alarm, and she was out of bed and pulling a shawl around her shoulders before she had fully processed what was happening. The still room, where the estate's preserved foods and medicinal herbs were stored, sat at the back of the house near the kitchens, and by the time Margaret reached the stairs, she could see orange light flickering against the walls below, throwing long shadows up the staircase. "Fire in the still room," a footman shouted, running past her with a bucket. "It's spreading toward the kitchen stores." Margaret's first thought, absurdly, was for the herbs she had spent weeks cataloging and organizing, months of careful work that represented one of the few useful contributions she had made to a household otherwise unfamiliar to her. Her second thought was far more urgent. If the fire reached the kitchen stores and the wooden beams above them, the damage to the house could be catastrophic, especially given how little money remained for repairs. She ran toward the smoke rather than away from it, ignoring Mrs. Fenwick's cry for her to stay back, and found the still room already half consumed by flame, staff members, forming a desperate chain of buckets from the well outside. Edward was already there, coat discarded, sleeves rolled up, directing the effort with a calm authority that surprised her even in the chaos of the moment. He caught sight of her, and his expression shifted instantly to alarm. "Get back," he shouted over the roar of the flames. "This is not safe." "I know how to handle fire," Margaret shouted back, already grabbing a bucket from a startled maid. "My father's shop caught flame once when I was 16. I know what burns fast and what can be saved." There was no time to argue further. The next several minutes passed in a blur of smoke and heat and shouted instructions, the entire household working together with a shared, desperate focus that erased, for the moment, every distinction between Duke and Duchess and staff. Margaret directed several footmen to clear a path for water toward the worst of the flames while Edward and 2 others worked to collapse a burning shelf before it could spread fire to the ceiling beams. The fire took nearly an hour to fully extinguish, and by the end of it, Margaret's hands were blistered and her lungs ached from smoke, but the kitchen stores had survived, and the damage remained contained to the still room alone. It could have been so much worse. It was only after the immediate danger had passed, after the staff had been sent to rest, and the smoke had begun to clear from the air, that Mrs. Fenwick pulled Edward aside with a troubled expression, and a piece of information that turned the whole night sideways. "The fire did not start from a candle left burning, Your Grace," she said quietly, glancing around to make certain no one else could hear. "One of the stable boys saw a man near the still room door not an hour before the smoke was noticed, a man he did not recognize. He assumed it was a tradesman making a delivery, but no deliveries were expected that night." Edward's face went very still. "You believe this fire was set deliberately?" "I believe someone wanted this house to burn, or at the very least, wanted to frighten the people inside it," Mrs. Fenwick said. Margaret, overhearing this from a few steps away, felt something cold settle over her, colder even than the fear of the fire itself. She thought of Gerald's smile at the ball, his careful, patient cruelty, his insistence that he had not accepted defeat. She thought too of Percival Crane, the creditor who had waited years for payment and who might now see an opportunity in her sudden, very public marriage into wealth. "It could have been either of them," she said aloud, and Edward turned to look at her, understanding immediately who she meant. "Or both, working toward the same end without even realizing it," Edward said grimly. "Gerald wants the estate. Crane wants his money. Either one benefits if this marriage collapses or if we are too frightened and distracted to fight back." Margaret looked down at her blistered hands, at the soot staining her nightgown, and felt something shift inside her chest, old grief rising unexpectedly through the exhaustion and fear of the night. She had spent 3 years since her husband's death trying to outrun the consequences of his recklessness, trying to build a life that owed nothing to anyone. And here it was again, following her into a house she had only just begun to consider a kind of home. "I am so tired of paying for choices I never made," she said quietly, more to herself than to Edward, her voice cracking in a way she had not intended to let show. Edward stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth still radiating from him after the fire, close enough that neither the exhaustion nor the danger of the night stopped him from reaching out and taking her blistered hand gently in his own. "You are not paying for them alone anymore," he said. "Whatever this is, whoever is behind it, we face it together now. That was never part of our agreement, but I am telling you regardless." Margaret looked up at him, smoke still faint in the air between them, and for a moment something old and guarded in her expression cracked open, just slightly, just enough for him to see the fear and grief she had been carrying alone since long before they had ever met. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, she pulled her hand back and straightened her shoulders, the familiar mask sliding back into place. "We should get some rest," she said. "There is much to sort through in the morning, and Gerald will not wait politely for us to recover before making his next move." She walked away before he could respond, leaving Edward standing alone in the smoke-stained hallway, watching her go with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the chaos of that night, from careful respect into something considerably more complicated. Neither of them spoke of the moment again in the days that followed, but it lingered between them regardless, an unresolved current running beneath every careful, businesslike conversation they continued to share. Percival Crane arrived at Cresthaven on a gray afternoon 8 days after the fire, and he did not bother sending word ahead. Margaret was in the still room, now half rebuilt, sorting through salvaged jars of dried herbs when Nora came rushing in, her face pale with alarm. "There is a man at the front door, Your Grace," Nora said. "He is asking for you by name, your old name. He says he will not leave until he speaks with you." Margaret's hands went still over the jars. She did not need to ask who it was. She had known this day would come eventually, ever since Gerald's questions in the village had stirred up old debts that should have stayed buried. She found Crane standing in the entrance hall, a thin man with sharp eyes and an unpleasant smile, exactly as she remembered him from 3 years earlier when he had first come to collect on her husband's debts. He looked her over with the same calculating expression he had worn back then, as though assessing how much value remained in her now that she carried a duchess's title alongside her old debts. "Margaret," he said, not bothering with any title at all, "you have moved up in the world since we last spoke." "You should not be here," Margaret said, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coiling tight in her stomach. "The debt was settled as far as I am able to settle it. You have taken everything I had to give." "Your husband owed me £800, Crane said. "You paid 200 over the years when the shop could spare it. That leaves 600 still owed. And I have been patient far longer than most men in my position would be. But patience runs thin when I hear the widow who once claimed poverty has married herself a duke." "My marriage has nothing to do with my late husband's debts," Margaret said. "Legally, perhaps not," Crane said, his smile widening unpleasantly. "But I imagine a duke's reputation is worth quite a lot to him. I imagine he would pay handsomely to keep his new duchess's old debts quiet, rather than see them dragged through the courts for all the county to read about in the papers." Before Margaret could respond, Edward's voice came from the top of the staircase, cold and controlled. "You will discuss any debts with me directly, sir, and you will do it in my study, not in my entrance hall where you have chosen to threaten my wife." Crane turned, seeming almost pleased to see the Duke had arrived to negotiate, and followed Edward into the study without further argument, leaving Margaret standing alone in the hall, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and fury. She did not wait outside like a woman content to let others decide her fate. She followed them into the study and took a seat before either man could object. "This concerns me," she said, when Edward opened his mouth to suggest she leave. "I will not be discussed as though I am a piece of furniture in my own home." Edward closed his mouth and gave a short nod, and Crane's eyebrows rose slightly, clearly unused to women asserting themselves so plainly in matters of money. "As I was explaining to your husband," Crane said smoothly, £600 remains owed on your late husband's debt. I am prepared to be reasonable about the terms of repayment, given your new circumstances, but I will not simply forget the sum because you have married into wealth." "How generous of you," Margaret said dryly. "I would also mention," Crane continued, ignoring her tone, "that a certain gentleman, a cousin of the Duke's I believe, approached me some weeks ago with an offer. He suggested that if I were to publicize this debt widely, timed appropriately, it might cause certain legal difficulties for this marriage. He offered to pay me handsomely for the trouble, more than the debt itself is worth." The room went very quiet. Margaret felt something cold settle over her, and beside her she saw Edward's jaw tighten. "Gerald offered to pay you to expose Margaret's debts publicly," Edward said slowly, "in an attempt to challenge the legitimacy of our marriage before the courts." "That is my understanding of his intention, yes," Crane said. "Though I confess, I found his offer less appealing than simply collecting what I am rightfully owed through more direct means. Publicity is unpredictable. Money in hand is not." "Then you refused him," Edward said. "I have not yet decided," Crane said, and his smile turned sharper. "That, Your Grace, depends entirely on what you are willing to offer me instead." Margaret felt the trap close around them slowly, the shape of Gerald's scheme finally becoming clear. He did not need to prove the marriage illegal. He only needed to create enough scandal, enough public doubt, enough legal noise to drag the matter into court, where a sympathetic judge with connections to Gerald's circle might rule the marriage void on some technical or moral ground, regardless of whether the will's literal conditions had been satisfied. "I will pay the £600 owed," Edward said finally, "in full immediately, but I will not pay a single shilling beyond that as a bribe to buy your silence. If you wish to sell information to my cousin, that is your choice to make, but you will not extract further payment from me for the privilege of behaving honestly." Crane considered this for a long moment, clearly weighing the guaranteed sum against the uncertain promise of a larger reward from Gerald. £600, paid today, and I will consider the debt fully settled," he said finally. "As for your cousin's offer, I make no promises about what I choose to do with information that is, after all, entirely true." "Then we understand each other," Edward said, and called for Whitfield to draw up the payment immediately, unwilling to give Crane a single hour to reconsider the terms. After Crane had gone, carriage rattling away down the long drive with payment in hand, Margaret sat alone in the study, staring at the empty space where the meeting had taken place, feeling the full weight of what had just occurred settle over her. "You did not have to pay that," she said quietly, when Edward returned from seeing Crane off the property. "I know," Edward said. "It was my debt, my husband's debt, not yours to solve. You told me yourself, the day we married, that Cresthaven falling apart would matter to both of us equally," Edward said, taking a seat across from her. "I find the same logic applies here. Your debts have become entangled with mine the moment Gerald decided to use them as a weapon against this marriage. Paying Crane was not charity, Margaret. It was removing one more tool from my cousin's hands before he could use it." Margaret studied him for a long moment, trying to find the calculation behind his words, the hidden cost he would eventually demand in exchange. She found none. only tired sincerity and something else beneath it that she was not yet ready to name. "He may still tell Gerald everything regardless," she said. "Men like Crane rarely feel bound by their word once money changes hands." "Then we will face that when it comes," Edward said. "But I would rather fight Gerald honestly in the open than live in fear of what secrets he might dig up next. You have spent 3 years hiding from your past, Margaret. I do not think hiding has made you any safer. I think it has only made you tired." The observation landed closer to the truth than Margaret was comfortable admitting. She had spent so long building walls to keep her old life contained, so long treating every question about her past as a threat to be deflected, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without bracing for the next blow. "You presume to know a great deal about me for a man I have been married to for less than a month," she said, though the sharpness in her voice had softened considerably. "I presume very little," Edward said. "I simply pay attention. It is one of the few skills my uncle's neglect actually taught me well." Despite herself, Margaret felt the corner of her mouth twitch upward, the first genuine, almost smile she had allowed herself in days. "That may be the closest thing to a compliment you have ever given me." "I intend to give you better ones eventually," Edward said, and something in the quiet honesty of the statement made the air between them shift again. The same current that had passed between them the night of the fire, unresolved and growing harder to ignore. 3 days later, the blow they had been dreading finally landed, though it came from a direction neither of them had fully anticipated. A formal letter arrived from the county court, addressed to Edward, informing him that a petition had been filed challenging the legitimacy of his marriage on the grounds that it had been entered into under circumstances of financial desperation and mutual deception, specifically citing undisclosed debts held by the Duchess prior to the union. The petition had been filed, unsurprisingly, by Gerald Pierce, and a hearing had already been scheduled with unusual speed, clearly the result of connections Gerald held within the local judiciary. Edward read the letter twice in his study, the same way he had read the original ultimatum from his uncle's will weeks earlier, and felt the familiar cold weight of everything he had built threatening to collapse all over again. He found Margaret in the garden, one of the few places in the house that still felt untouched by debt or scandal, and handed her the letter without a word. She read it in silence, her face growing paler with each line, until she reached the end and looked up at him with an expression he had never seen on her before, something close to genuine fear. "He is going to use everything," she said quietly. "My husband's debts, Crane's testimony if he chooses to give it, the speed of our marriage, all of it laid out before a judge who likely owes Gerald some favor or another. Then we will need a defense stronger than anything he can bring against us," Edward said. "And if we do not have one?" Margaret asked. Edward did not answer immediately, and the silence between them said more than any reassurance could have. Whatever came next would decide not only the fate of Cresthaven, but everything that had begun to grow, quietly and against both their expectations, in the weeks since a broken carriage wheel had brought them together. The county courthouse filled quickly on the morning of the hearing. Word having spread through Thornfield and beyond that the Duke of Cresthaven's hasty marriage was about to be picked apart in public. Margaret sat beside Edward at the front of the room, her hands folded tightly in her lap, aware of every whisper and curious glance directed at her back. Gerald sat across the aisle, dressed in his finest coat, looking entirely too pleased with himself for a man about to argue against his own family. Beside him sat a solicitor Margaret did not recognize, along with, to her considerable surprise, Percival Crane, seated a few rows back with an unreadable expression on his thin face. The judge, a stern-faced man named Justice Holloway, called the proceedings to order and invited Gerald's solicitor to present the petition. The argument, when it came, was exactly as thorough and damaging as Margaret had feared. Gerald's solicitor laid out the timeline of the marriage in stark, unflattering terms. The broken carriage, the meeting in an apothecary shop, the wedding held within a single day, all of it framed as evidence of a transaction rather than a genuine union. Then came the matter of Margaret's debts, presented with careful emphasis on every detail that painted her as a woman who had concealed her financial troubles in order to secure a wealthy husband before those troubles could be discovered. Will of the late Duke required a legitimate marriage, Gerald's solicitor argued, not merely a legal transaction dressed in the appearance of one. We contend that this union was entered into under false pretenses, with material facts concealed by the Duchess regarding her financial situation, and with speed clearly intended to circumvent proper scrutiny of the match. Such a marriage cannot reasonably be considered to satisfy the spirit of the will, regardless of whether it satisfies its letter. Justice Holloway turned to Edward's solicitor, Mr. Whitfield, and invited a response. Whitfield stood, adjusting his spectacles, and began methodically dismantling the argument point by point, citing precedent after precedent regarding the legal standing of marriages entered into for practical reasons, noting that English law had never required romantic courtship as a prerequisite for legitimacy, only proper legal procedure, which had been followed to the letter. It was a solid defense, careful and precise, but Margaret could see in the judge's expression that Whitfield's dry legal arguments were not fully countering the emotional narrative Gerald's solicitor had constructed, the picture of a desperate woman hiding her debts to trap a wealthy husband. When Whitfield finished, Justice Holloway called Percival Crane forward to testify regarding the nature and extent of Margaret's debts, and Margaret felt her stomach drop entirely. Whatever loyalty Edward's payment had purchased, it seemed, had not been enough to keep Crane away from Gerald's courtroom entirely. Crane took his seat with visible discomfort, glancing briefly at Margaret before addressing the court. "I was owed £800 by the late husband of the Duchess," Crane said. "200 was repaid over several years through honest effort on her part, working her father's shop to near exhaustion from what I observed personally. The remaining 600 was paid in full by the Duke himself, 8 days past, settling the matter entirely and honestly." "And is it true," Gerald's solicitor pressed, "that my client offered you payment to publicize this debt in a manner timed to damage this marriage?" The room went very still. Margaret held her breath, certain the answer would seal their fate one way or another. "It is true," Crane said, and Margaret's heart sank until he continued, "and I refused him. I am a man owed money, not a man for hire to destroy marriages for sport. The Duke paid what was rightfully owed to me without argument or delay, treating the matter with more honesty than most gentlemen of his rank bother extending to men in my position. I saw no reason to reward Mr. Pierce's scheme with my cooperation, particularly given how plainly it was intended purely to serve his own interests rather than any genuine concern for justice." A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Gerald's face flushed with an anger he could not quite hide behind his composed expression. Justice Holloway made a note, his expression giving nothing away, and dismissed Crane from the stand. "Is there anything further either party wishes to add before I retire to consider my ruling?" the judge asked. Margaret felt Edward's hand find hers beneath the table where no one else could see, a small, steadying gesture. Then, to her surprise, he stood. "Your Honor, if I may," Edward said, and Justice Holloway gestured for him to continue. "My cousin has argued that this marriage was a mere transaction, lacking the legitimacy the will demanded. I will not pretend the circumstances of our wedding were traditional. We married quickly, out of necessity, two strangers brought together by an unkind deadline neither of us chose. But I would ask the court to consider what has happened in the weeks since that hurried ceremony, rather than judging the marriage solely by the day it began." He paused, and Margaret watched him with her heart pounding, uncertain what he intended to say. My wife has spent every day since our wedding working tirelessly to save an estate that was, quite frankly, failing long before she ever arrived," Edward continued. "She uncovered theft within my own household that I had failed to notice for years. She ran into a burning building without hesitation to help save my home, at real risk to her own safety. She faced threats and public humiliation from my cousin with more courage than I have seen from men twice her size and standing. Whatever this marriage began as, Your Honor, it has become something considerably more than a transaction. I did not fall in love with my wife before our wedding, because there was no time for such a thing. But I have fallen in love with her every single day since, watching her fight for a home and a family that were never originally her own, simply because she refused to watch them fail when she knew how to help." The courtroom had gone utterly silent. Margaret stared up at Edward, feeling something crack open in her chest, wide and warm and entirely unguarded for the first time since her husband's death 3 years ago had taught her to keep every door locked tight. "If the court finds that this marriage does not meet the spirit of my uncle's will," Edward said, turning back to face the judge, "then I would ask that the ruling reflect the truth of the matter honestly, not the twisted version my cousin has presented for his own gain. This marriage may have begun out of desperation, but it has not remained that way, and I do not believe my uncle's will was ever truly concerned with romance. I believe it was concerned with whether I would take responsibility for this family and this estate. I have never taken that responsibility more seriously than I have since the day Margaret agreed to share it with me." Justice Holloway studied Edward for a long moment, then turned his attention to Margaret. "Duchess, do you have anything you wish to add?" Margaret stood slowly, aware of every eye in the room upon her, aware most of all of Edward standing close beside her, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had never seen from him before. "I married a stranger because I needed money for my shop, and he needed a wife by sundown," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt beneath it. "That is the truth, and I will not pretend otherwise to satisfy this court's sense of romance. But I have spent 3 years building walls around myself after my first marriage taught me that trusting people leads only to inheriting their mistakes. In the weeks since I married Edward Hartley, I have found something I did not expect to find ever again. Someone who paid a debt that was mine to bear without asking anything in return. Someone who defended me publicly when it would have been easier to let the gossip pass unchallenged. Someone who saw the worst chapters of my past and chose to stand beside me rather than walk away. If that is not the spirit of a legitimate marriage, Your Honor, then I do not know what is." The room remained silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. Justice Holloway made several more notes, then announced that he would retire to consider his ruling and would return within the hour. The wait felt endless. Margaret and Edward sat together in a small antechamber, neither speaking much, both too aware of how much rested on a single man's decision. When the summons finally came to return to the courtroom, Margaret felt her legs nearly give way beneath her as she stood. Justice Holloway took his seat and regarded the full room with the same stern, unreadable expression he had worn throughout the proceedings. "I have considered the petition brought before this court carefully," he began. "The law is clear that legitimacy of marriage rests upon proper legal procedure, which was undisputedly followed in this case. The petitioner's argument rests not on legal grounds but on moral characterization of the marriage's origins, characterization which I find, based on the testimony presented today, to be considerably less damning than intended, and in the case of the witness, Mr. Crane, actively contradicted." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. "I find the petition without merit. The marriage between Edward Hartley, Duke of Crestheaven, and Margaret Hartley, formerly Voss, stands as fully legitimate under both the letter and, I am now satisfied, the spirit of the late Duke's will. This petition is dismissed, and I would advise the petitioner to consider carefully before bringing further challenges before this court on similarly thin grounds." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Margaret felt Edward's hand tighten around hers as relief flooded through her body so completely that she nearly lost her balance entirely. Across the aisle, Gerald sat rigid with fury. His carefully constructed scheme collapsed entirely in the span of a single ruling, while beside him, his solicitor gathered papers with the resigned air of a man who had lost a case badly and knew it. Outside the courthouse, standing in the pale afternoon sunlight with the weight of weeks of fear finally lifted from her shoulders, Margaret turned to find Edward watching her with an expression she had never quite seen from him before, something soft and unguarded and entirely sincere. "You meant what you said in there," she said, not quite a question. "Every word," Edward said. "I should have told you privately first, rather than announcing it to an entire courtroom, but I find I am not always the most patient man when something matters enough to me." "I noticed," Margaret said, though there was no sharpness in it now, only something warm threading through her voice that had not been there in months, perhaps years. "Our agreement," Edward said carefully, "stated that this would remain a business arrangement, that I would not presume upon anything you did not offer freely." "I remember the terms," Margaret said. "I wrote most of them myself." "I would like to renegotiate," Edward said, "if you are willing." Margaret studied him for a long moment, the man who had walked into her shop as a desperate stranger, and had somehow, through weeks of fires and threats in courtrooms, become someone she trusted with more than just an estate's ledgers. "What terms did you have in mind?" she asked, and there was something almost playful in it now, a lightness that had been buried under debts and grief for far too long. "No conditions at all," Edward said. "Only whatever you are willing to give freely, and whatever I am able to offer in return, for as long as you will have me." Margaret felt the last of her carefully built walls finally give way entirely, not with the crash she had always feared, but gently, like a door long locked finally easing open to let in the light. "I believe," she said, "that arrangement suits me considerably better than the last one." She took his offered arm, and together they walked away from the courthouse, away from Gerald's schemes and Crane's debts and every ghost of her old life that had followed her this far, toward a home that had, somewhere in the chaos of the past weeks, finally begun to feel like it truly belonged to both of them equally. Behind them, the county would talk for months about the Duke who had married a stranger and somehow, against every expectation, found in her the truest partner Cresthaven had seen in generations. But Margaret and Edward, walking slowly through the fatting afternoon light, found they cared very little what the county had to say about it anymore.